Hi everyone, Nanette here with Potential Actually. In the last video, we looked at the stress response and how we can manage our emotional state as a shortcut to managing our stress response. This video builds off the last one by focusing on what happens when we stay in our stress response for too long and begin experiencing burnout. We'll look at the factors leading to burnout and some more comprehensive stress management techniques to complete our stress response so we can head it off before it overwhelms us. I think you'll see how this video is in some ways the culminating point of all the other videos in this series. I like to start by defining burnout so we have a common language and understanding about the topic before we dive into it. The term burnout was coined in 1975 by psychologist Herbert Freudenberger. His focus of study in the late 70s and early 80s was on understanding and treating stress, chronic fatigue, and substance abuse. He was the first to describe symptoms of exhaustion professionally and perform a comprehensive study on the phenomenon he called burnout. Based on his research, he defined burnout as a state of mental and physical exhaustion caused by one's professional life. He believed there were three main components that defined burnout: emotional exhaustion, fatigue that comes from carrying too much for too long, depersonalization, depletion of empathy, caring, and compassion, where you may feel alienated or increased feelings of frustration or perhaps feeling numb. And the third, decreasing sense of accomplishment. This unconquerable sense of futility, feeling like nothing you do makes much difference. Although there's many self-questionnaires on burnout readily available on the web, there's a lot of overlap between depression and burnout, so it's important people see a mental health professional to get an appropriate diagnosis. Although Freudenberger and many of his early predecessors focused primarily on professional life, there's a lot of research now showing that people can become burnt out in other realms of their lives. In particular for women, the home life and pressures that come with balancing kids and a job is an area that's often causes burnout. In these times, you can see the burnout building in many folks in response to the COVID restrictions and requirements and the demand to live in a state of constant uncertainty. It's difficult to achieve a sense of normalcy when you're constantly shifting to react to an ever-changing circumstance. In the previous videos in this series, I discussed how there are different kinds of stress. Eustress, which motivates us, and distress, which causes us to shut down. The game being to try and stay in a state of peak performance by finding that balance between the eustress and distress where we're optimally motivated without being overwhelmed. Our stress response kicks in when we move into a situation causing us distress. And when we stay in that space, even with mild, constant distress for long periods of time, we begin to shut down. Our bodies get worn out and we become physically ill. But often, before we even feel the physical effects, our minds have already begun to shut down. Since there's still a lot of stigma regarding mental illness, many people don't talk about it, and we miss the early warning signs that we're heading into burnout territory. Often, this puts us in a place of attempting to reactively deal with our burnout, which is much more difficult than proactively dealing with it. This video, we're going to look at ways of assisting in managing our stress to help us deal effectively with it before we end up in a state of burnout. If you believe you're suffering effects of burnout, I would strongly encourage you to get assistance from a mental health professional. Just as you would seek out a medical professional if you couldn't deal with a physical issue on your own, it's always best to seek out a mental health professional to assist you in dealing with or even assessing overall mental health. What's most critical to understand when managing the distress that causes burnout is that there's a difference between dealing with your stress response and dealing with the stressors. As Amelia and Emily Nagasaki point out in their book Burnout, dealing with your stress is a separate process from dealing with the things that cause stress. Stressors are the internal or external factors that activate the stress response. And stress is the neurological or physiological shift in your body in response to your perception of stressors. Popular media has brainwashed us a bit into believing that dealing with or eliminating the stressors will eliminate the stress. And this is just not true. We must address both and complete the stress response. If you don't complete the stress response, your body stays stuck in it, like having the gas pedal stuck. Even though you're address the stressors and they might be gone, you're still having that undercurrent of stress because you haven't fully completed or moved through that response and told it that it's time to shut down. This can further contribute to your distress and lead to burnout. As long as you're not releasing it and you continue to stuff it down, that undercurrent remains in your life. And even small amounts over time build up until just the slightest thing will set it off. This is why it's so important to deal with the stress response and make sure that we're moving through that in positive ways. In order to complete the stress response, we need to do something that signals to our body that we're now safe. Completing the stress response is not an intellectual exercise. Telling ourselves that we're safe does not work. The area of our brain, the limbic system, that's responsible for our stress response is responsible for our emotions, not rationalizing. So sitting there and telling yourself that you're okay and rationalizing the situation isn't going to work. We need to convey this to our limbic system in a way that it understands, and we do that through our body language. So we need to do something that's really tangible and physical to complete our stress response and release all of that pent up energy that we created. And if you watch, animals are really, really good at completing their stress response because they're not trying to intellectualize it. If you think of whenever you might have seen a video or a caption of prey being chased by a predator, once that prey escapes, they don't sit down and start telling themselves, oh, it's okay, the lion's gone now, you're safe. No, they actually will shake, and they'll shake all over, and then they'll often return back to their pack or their herd, and they'll nuzzle up with them. And they do these physical things that allow them to shake off what they've built up in order to respond to that situation. And our limbic systems are really no different than a rabbit or a gazelle. We really need to do something physical to release that. And there's a few different ways we can do this. Physical activity is really one of the best ways. 30 to 60 minutes of physical activity will help us in completing our stress response. And it doesn't need to be crazy physical activity, but we need to at least get our heart rate up a bit, get breathing a little bit more heavily in order to help complete that response. And the breath is another good way that will help us dealing with our stress response. So deep, slow, full breaths where we're really filling up, like and really releasing as you let go. Positive social interactions is another way. So even casual, friendly interactions, even small talk with someone at the bank or in the lunchroom helps us to release that stress. Laughter, genuine belly laughs, not the nervous laughter that you do to cover up awkward moments, but like full on real laugh. And affection. A 20-second hug where each person stands in their own space and leans into each other is a really good way of doing that. And there's nothing particularly magical about 20 seconds other than it needs to be longer than just a quick pat on the back. You really need to lean in, each person leaning into the other and really feeling that space of being held. Crying. Big, old, ugly cry where you're not holding back at all, where you just let it all go. Sometimes, you just want to put on one of those sappy chick flicks and just let it all come out. For those who aren't into physical activity, another really great way to release is through creative expression. So art or playing a musical instrument, anything where you really engage and that allows you to get really into the creativity aspect will really help in working through it. Something else that art allows us to do is really explore those emotions that are coming up, and that really helps with the release as well. Um, Combining activities like yoga, where you're combining the physical movement with the breathing, or hanging out with a group of people that are really close to you and sharing stories and having a good laugh. These things put together really helped to release all of the negative tension that can be built up by holding on to that stress response. Now, completion is necessary for shaking off any stress that builds up during the course of the day. And in today's modern world, especially right now, there's a ton of low-level stress that's just assaulting us and putting us into these mild states of distress every day. And unfortunately, because we get so used to it being around us, we don't often notice the ways that it's impacting us, especially over the longer term. However, we can also deal with our stressors to assist us in preempting that stress response. And it's even better to keeping ourselves in that state of eustress versus distress. So if we go back to our model of peak mental performance, there's an area of our prefrontal cortex that Emily and Amelia Nagasaki refer to as the monitor, which is much easier to say than discrepancy reducing, increasing feedback loop, and criterion velocity. Essentially, the monitor describes the area of your brain that is responsible for knowing your goals, tracking the effort you're putting toward it, and then the progress you're making. And keeping your monitor happy helps you to keep in that state of peak performance. When the perceived level of effort you put in seems relatively low compared to the perceived level of progress that you're making, then your monitor's happy. However, if the perceived level of effort is greater than the progress that you're making, then your monitor starts to become quite upset. And what's important here is that I said perceived. So proactively managing your stress to stay in a peak of mental state is where you can start rationalizing with yourself, because now you're working with your monitor, which is your prefrontal cortex where your rationality resides. You may notice that the strategies that keep your monitor happy are very similar to the emotional regulation strategies that we discussed in the previous video, just a little bit more robust. And so we're going to look at four main strategies from the book Burnout. Planful problem solving, where you're managing the stressors you can control. Positive reappraisal, where you're managing stressors you can't control. Redefining winning, when your effort is greater than your progress. And redefining failing, where your effort is greater than your progress and you can't break it down into smaller goals. So planful problem solving is really helpful where you can change the amount of effort you're investing. So when we go back to that simple formula around effort versus progress, we're going to look at making the monitor happy by changing the level of effort we're putting in so that it seems like our effort overall is reduced and our progress will be better. So this requires us to analyze the problem to see where we can reduce our effort and then make plan to do that and execute on that plan. So for example, maybe you have a big presentation coming up and you know that presentation stressed you out. So you might want to start looking at what specifically about that is going to stress you out. Maybe you're worried you won't know what to say or you're going to stumble over that. So your plan could be to script everything out and spend a lot of time practicing with it, doing that in front of a mirror so that you feel comfortable in the way that your presentation is coming across and that you're not going to stumble over your words when you get there. Or maybe you're afraid the technology that you're using for your presentation isn't going to work. So maybe you make some handouts, you arrive early, set everything up, test it out, make sure it's not going to fail. Or perhaps you're just concerned that you're going to look silly because you aren't able to answer a question properly. And so you enlist the help of some friends or some colleagues to throw all sorts of questions at you, the crazier the better, so that you feel really well prepared going into that situation. So that's an example of planful problem solving. So positive reprisal is what you can do when you can't really control or change the kind of effort that you're putting in. You have to do this extra effort, and you just know that your progress is going to be a bit slow or that it's going to take time. Say you're trying to lose weight, and it's going to take some time for all that weight to come off. Um, or you're trying to learn a new skill, like learning a new language or a new instrument, and you're just going to have to put in a lot of time and effort, and your progress is going to be a bit slow. So, this strategy calls for us to actually reframe that struggle in terms of what we're gaining as a result of what we're doing. And this takes us back to the video on personal balance, where we're understanding our activities and goals in relation to our values and our purpose. So, it puts our struggle, reframes it in terms of what we're gaining from it, the creativity and the learning that we're taking from it, or how we're creating additional capacity to deal with other challenges, or empowering us by taking on a new skill, um, or learning something new that we hadn't done before. And in their book Burnout, Emily and Amelia say it as, when you're doing something that feels uncomfortable, you're probably doing something that creates more and better progress. Strength is a response of doing something effortful. So this strategy requires us not only to reframe our difficulties, but also to understand that the struggle itself is an opportunity for growth and learning, which takes us back to that video on mindset and embracing and growing that growth mindset. So redefining winning is helpful where you know that your progress is going to be painfully slow, and you just need to manage your expectations and change your definition in relationship with winning. So your effort's really high, your progress is really slow, and you're just starting to feel like it's a bit of a grind. And this kind of situation can be super tough to get through. So this strategy focuses on breaking down that larger goal into smaller achievable goals. So essentially setting milestones that you can mark and celebrate as progress that's made. So this brings your focus onto the progress that you are making, um, and hopefully you're broken it down into small enough milestones that you can do that with fairly regular frequency. So think of this as like if you're planning a long road trip, you would break it up into segments where there would be pit stops for rest and refuel. And so you need to think of this strategy like planning for that longer journey. And where the journey might be overwhelming and exhausting, you need to pace yourself and build in those times to rest and refuel. Um, in the business world, there's an approach called agile, where you break projects down into what are called sprints, where you can put in short bursts of concentrated energy with a lot of focus on one small goal, and then the next, and the next, and then those eventually take you to your end goal. For this strategy to be effective, it's important that those milestones or sprints feel like achievements within themselves. So they have to be achievable without much effort. They need to be within your control, and they have to feel good. So this needs to be a carrot, not a stick. So remember, fear and avoidance leads to burnout. So you don't want to feed into this. This needs to feel good to be able to get there. And you want to be able to concentrate on something that's measurable, so you know that you've arrived and you can sort of celebrate, like, okay, I've reached this point. And it needs to relate to something that you care about deeply. Again, back to that connection into purpose and values. So this strategy taps into that discussion that we had around that, and how you want to have motivation or resilience over the long term. You really need to touch back and touch base with those values and that purpose to help in sustaining you, so it doesn't feel like it's just a grind. Okay, and finally, we'll look at redefining failing. So when your progress is slow, setbacks are high, and you can't necessarily break what you're doing down into these smaller chunks, um, some journeys are just going to be fraught with setbacks, and there's not much that you can do about that. Um, so this strategy goes one step further than positive reappraisal by framing the setbacks in terms of what benefits are gained from the stumbles or from the failures. So when you look at many great scientific discoveries of our time, you'll notice this common theme of failure gone right. Many of them were accidents, or initial failures that actually turned out to have really amazing benefits, not just for the person doing the research, but for people overall. So it's critical to start changing or redefining that definition and relationship with failure, and to recognize it doesn't necessarily take the sting out of the stumble, but this strategy, when paired with stress completion, um, starts to help you work through those stumbles and see how they're contributing to a more positive outcome. To help work through changing the definition or relationship with winning and failure, we're going to try to work through this together in a bit of an exercise. So take a moment to think about a goal you're trying to reach, or a situation where you feel like you continue to put a lot of effort, but nothing's really coming of it, or where you're experiencing a lot of setbacks. So just take a moment to close your eyes and to come inside and just connect with that goal, or that situation, or that experience where you're putting in a lot of effort, but it feels like you're spinning your wheels. You're not really going anywhere. What is that situation, experience, goal that's coming to you in that scenario? And as you think about that, think about, can you break that down into smaller, achievable chunks? Is this a long journey? Is it going to take you a while? How can you change your relationship then, so you start to recognize the progress that you are making? What's one little step and one little step and one little step that you can do that will keep you moving forward? How would you measure that? How do you know that you've arrived? Is it just saying, I'm going to do 20 minutes of activity every day and marking off the days on a calendar? for 3 months or 6 months, so that every time you can see that you've done that? Is it a goal that you can measure on a scale or weigh? Or at least say, I need to do this activity this number of times. Is there some way that you can know that you've arrived and measure your progress and start to feel better about the progress that you are making and celebrate the progress that you do make in some way? If you're struggling with ideas on how you could do that, can you flip it around and say, okay, there's been some setbacks, but I'm learning a lot. I'm starting to build some resilience. And each setback along the way, this is what I've learned, and this is what I've learned, and here's how I've pivoted to respond. Or can you maybe think of another situation that you've been in where you persevered, or you stuck with it and you made it through, and know that you're capable in some way of getting there. And when you do, you're stronger for having had that struggle, for having stuck with it. And finally, is there something about what you're doing that you know you can't give it up because it ties into a value? What is this bringing you that speaks to you about your purpose or your values in life? Maybe it feels like it's a matter of principle. What is that specifically? How would you put that into words so that you could have it somewhere and refer back to it on the days when the going gets tough? What's pulling you in? What's creating that intrinsic need or that intrinsic drive so that you feel engaged with this? And finally, just place your hand on your heart and give yourself some compassion for the struggle that you're in and for continuing to keep at it, even though it's hard. For knowing that sometimes you'll have to stumble, and that's okay, because it's not about the stumble. It's really about picking yourself up and getting out there over and over again. Just like with our meditation, it's not about how many times our mind drifts away. It's about how many times we notice the drift and we come back. You can come back into the space now and let that go. You might want to have a journal or something where you can note down some of the ideas that came to you, but you may find it helpful to sit through this exercise a few times, maybe focusing on different components of how you're having your relationship with winning or failure, or how you might be able to do some planful problem solving. It's helpful to sit in a space where you can be somewhat outside of the stress, where your limbic system is dampened, so you can bring that rational thought, that wisdom to the situation and help you get some clarity. In this video, we looked at how burnout is a state of mental and physical fatigue, depletion of empathy and sense of futility that comes from caring too much for too long. When we simmer in all our unresolved stress for too long, we are headed for burnout. In order to head off that burnout, we need to both complete the stress cycle through physical, tangible action that tells our body that we're safe, and by proactively managing the stressors in our life. We looked at 4 strategies for managing our monitor by balancing our perceptions of effort and progress. These strategies called on concepts from previous videos of embracing the growth mindset and focusing our values and purpose, keeping us moving toward something that matters and recognizing even our stumbles contribute to our growth and resilience. I hope this video series brings you some practical solutions to help you in managing and navigating stress in your life. And I genuinely hope you and your families blossom in this time of adversity, that we can take this manure and hopefully grow something really beautiful out of it. Thank you for joining, and happy meditating.